In the early 1940s, most European territories were either neutral or under Adolf Hitler's control. Meanwhile, the British were terrified of a seemingly impending invasion. British officials came up with hundreds of ideas to save their nation in case of an attack. One of them was a secret program codenamed Operation Vegetarian. Had the secret program ever been implemented, millions of German citizens would have lost their lives. To this day, several thousand square miles of European soil might still be unoccupied. In 1942, Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a task to Dr. Paul Fildes, the biology department director at the secret military research facility of Porton Down. The expert was asked to find a new chemical innovation to hinder the booming German war industry's progress. With nuclear weapons still not in the picture, biological warfare was thought to be one of the most effective war strategies. Dr. Fildes came up with the idea of dropping anthrax-contaminated cattle dietary supplements, also known as cattle cakes, onto German pastures. Such an operation would destroy the meat supply chain and consequently cause an enormous death toll due to a nationwide anthrax poisoning. Since anthrax spores can remain alive in the soil for more than a century, said poisoned land would remain uninhabitable for generations. Neither humans nor animals would be able to set foot there for many decades after the war had ended. Churchill loved the idea. He accepted the plan, and the British Royal Army initiated production of over 5 million tampered cattle cakes. The goal was to drop them over different areas of Germany by customized Royal Air Force bombers. The cakes were tested on Grenard Island, off the coast of Scotland. Dr. Fildes noted that the animals quickly ate the infected supplements. Quote, "Trials have shown that these tablets are found and consumed by the cattle in a very short time." Operation Vegetarian was never greenlit because by then, the war had turned decisively against Germany. The war's course stopped the operation from ever happening, but even the preparations caused some irreversible damage. Due to the widespread anthrax infection, the island where the cakes were tested remained contaminated and desolate until the 1990s. Eventually, over 5 million produced cakes to be disseminated in Germany were incinerated in 1945 when World War II ended. Operation Cauldron. Operation Cauldron was a secret series of biological warfare trials performed by the British government in the early 1950s. For Operation Cauldron, Porton Down scientists in the Royal Navy released a series of biological agents, including pneumonic and bubonic plague and brucellosis, on caged animals, subsequently testing its effects. Said experiments were tested at sea, just off the coast of the Isle of Lewis, aboard a floating pontoon supported by the SS Ben Lomond. The animals were caged on the pontoon's deck, while scientists dispersed the viruses via a dropped bomb-like device or by spraying it. After exposure, the critters were taken aboard the SS Ben Lomond. The ones that perished were dissected and examined thoroughly. Overall, 3,492 guinea pigs and 83 monkeys were used in Operation Cauldron. Although tests were initially a success, only a year later, the trials showed different results. Official reports stated that, quote, "Brucellosis has not increased its reputation as a dangerous agent." An incident during the final test of the series hindered any remaining chance of success. After ignoring warnings to steer clear of the secret testing area, the trawler Corella and its crew of 18 men unknowingly sailed through a cloud of plague bacteria on their way back from a fishing trip in Icelandic waters. This incident caused plenty of concern from officials about a very possible plague outbreak at its home port in the north of England. The ship wasn't stopped for quarantine, disinfection, nor thorough medical examination. Instead, the vessel was kept under secret observation for 21 days by a destroyer warship and a fisheries vessel. The ship's radio communications were secretly monitored by the government in case of medical distress. This surveillance period also included a period of shore leave at Blackpool, where the men mixed with the citizens as usual. Surprisingly, nobody in the crew got ill. The incident was known to the highest government levels, from the UK's Royal Navy and Naval Service to Winston Churchill himself. The event was successfully hidden from the public. Even after all the danger had passed, most of the incident documents were ordered to be burned. Even the Corella trawler crew were unaware of the incident 50 years later when they were interviewed for a documentary. Edgewood Arsenal, Project Dork. From 1948 to 1975, the U.S. Army conducted secret chemical tests on 7,000 soldiers and 1,000 civilians at the Edgewood Arsenal facility in Maryland. The purposes of the tests were to investigate the effects of low-dose incapacitating agents, protective clothing, pharmaceuticals, and vaccines on humans. Over 7,000 subjects were part of the investigation. At least 254 chemical compounds, including LSD, PCP, BZ, atropine, and mustard gas, were tested on the men. Their reactions were filmed in large quantities of footage. Mental disturbances, severe hallucinations, and loss of self-control were all recorded. Experiments using aerosolized BZ, also tested in this project, eventually led to the production of 49 tons of the agent, which were loaded into cluster bombs. In 1975, after police outcry about the ethical implications of human guinea pigs, the U.S. Congress shut down the facility. A 1979 story in the newspaper The Sun told the story of Soldier Gary, one of the unknowing test subjects. He said, quote, "They told me it would be like taking aspirin." Gary reported that he suffered from severe depression in the years after testing at the facility. Also controversial were the Army's methods of getting rid of these chemical weapons. In the 1970s, most of the substances were set on fire, but one of the chemicals, which has components also found in rocket fuel, made their way into the area's tap water. Over 45 years after its termination, the secret Edgewood Arsenal clinical trials are now just a faint memory within the Army and medical research. But what happened at the Maryland facility remains a touchy subject for some of the surviving test subjects, their families, and the doctors who administered the drugs. Operation Tunnel's Water Bucket 2 tests. Biological warfare options were explored deep into the 70s. As the Vietnam War dragged on for more years than planned, the U.S. military began exploring harsher options to drive the Viet Cong out from their hiding spots in underground tunnels. While the Army experimented with CS riot control gas, other ideas were being tested at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. In the tests, volunteers and U.S. soldiers were locked in a sealed chamber and filmed as the riot gas was turned on. The soldiers were unfamiliar with the compound, but were assured that it was safe and that the side effects were only temporary. Later, these experiments also helped to judge the effectiveness of the dispersion and the penetration of this agent in Viet Cong's underground tunnels. Although it was initially described as a non-lethal weapon, a more current scientific study has suggested it can cause long-term pulmonary damage. Operation Do, Operation Lack. Concern over a possible biological attack on the United States grew in the latter half of the 20th century. This led the U.S. government to test how some biological warfare options might be deployed in the country. Operation Large Area Coverage, commonly known as LAC, was a U.S. Army Chemical Corps operation that dispersed microscopic zinc-cadmium sulfide particles over huge swaths of the United States and Canada. The goal was to test their dispersal patterns, which would later help to examine the geographic range of chemical or biological weapons. 3 series of tests were performed leading up to the official Operation LAC procedures. The first was a series of 6 simulated attacks conducted in the Bay Area in 1950. The most notorious set of tests were the trials over the South Carolina and Georgia coasts under the codename Operation Do. Scientists concluded that long-range aerosol clouds could travel for hundreds of miles when disseminated from the ground. The final test occurred in 1957 in the North Sea, Britain's east coast, where scientists examined the particles' dispersion under different meteorological conditions, such as heavy rains. For the official Operation LAC testing, the Air Force loaned the Army a C-119 transport aircraft to disperse the chemicals by the ton in the atmosphere over the United States. The first official test occurred on December 2, 1957, on a path from South Dakota to Minnesota. Operation LAC's tests were designed to determine the dispersion and geographic range of biological or chemical agents. Ground stations tracked the fluorescent zinc-cadmium sulfide particles. Some of them were detected up to 1,200 miles away from their drop point. After the first test, much of the material dispersed ended up being carried by winds all the way to Canada. After a dense mass of cold air in Canada moved the particles, some were even detected in the Gulf of Mexico. The particles released in Operation LAC were thought to be harmless, just a stand-in for real biological warfare agents such as anthrax, but the operation's chemical is now considered a human pathogen. It was estimated that over 800,000 residents were exposed to the pathogen. At least one person is thought to have been lost in the experiment.